Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. Again, this is a presentation that is ultimately going to be for a paper that's going to appear hopefully in the Northern Mariner, which is the journal for the Canadian Nautical Research Society, but I recognize this is aviation and not maritime nautical stuff. So I've changed. I've included more pictures of planes, less pictures of boats to sort of cater to the audience. And I'm going to be talking today, though, about Sable Island. And specifically the unknown aviation and anti-submarine warfare history of Sable Island. I decided to include a picture of course, I'm sure many of you know this is one of the iconic B-24 VLR Liberators that was used during the Battle of the Atlantic. And this is it unfortunately landing on Sable Island in February of 1945. So it shows that aircraft oftentimes come to unhappy ends when it comes to Sable Island. Now, the biggest thing that most people know is Sable Island as the graveyard of the Atlantic. But instead, I want you to think about, instead of shipwrecks, and we have some nice pictures of shipwrecks here, think back to December of 1960. So it's December in the North Atlantic Ocean. There's a survey team from the Royal Canadian Navy headed by Lieutenant Commander N.T. Long. He's an engineer who operates out of the Canadian Naval Base at Shearwater, which we were mentioning before. And they are sent to survey the site of Sable Island to build an airstrip that would operate the C-2SF tracker aircraft off of. He described the surface of Sable Island upon landing and surveying it for potential airfield sites as being completely unsuitable for the use of any airfield, being either too wet, too steep, or covered with shifting, unstable sand. An island named, indeed, after the French word for sand. It shouldn't be a surprise that it is, in fact, covered with sand. That's maybe not a big surprise, but here we are. But this reflects the fact that the Royal Canadian Navy and the Royal Canadian Air Force, from the period of 1940 through to 1968, and really beyond, my presentation is going to end in 1968, had a strong interest in Sable Island because of its geographic location and because of its potential and unrealized potential, ultimately, for being a base in a broader struggle against first German and then later Soviet submarines operating in the North Atlantic. And so I want to talk about this process. Why were they interested in Sable Island? And what exactly were they planning to do with this big, long strip of sand? And how was this connecting with broader Canadian aviation history? So no more pictures. No, or there'll be a few more pictures of ships, but no more talk of shipwrecks. Plane crashes? Yes. So some basics about Sable Island here. It's between 35 and 46 kilometers long. There's been multiple surveys of the island, and many of them come up with different lengths. Part of this depends on whether it's high or low tide and whether how much of the sand is shifted. There's some debate amongst surveyors about whether the island's position has substantially shifted over the past 200 years or not. Either way, though, the sands are not a particularly stable base, and they're between the curve, as you can see on the presentation picture here, is the NASA satellite imagery. It's about 1.2 to 1.6 kilometers wide, and surprisingly has a maximum elevation of 26 meters, so about 100 feet, which is really quite a high sand dune. It's located 177 kilometers off the coast of Nova Scotia and 300 kilometers as the crow or puffin or cormorant or pick your North Atlantic seabird flies from Halifax. Again, as I mentioned, there's been over 350 known wrecks off of Sable Island. The first one was in 1590s, and the last one was in 1947. The Sable Island also is most well known for, I think, many of you, and certainly the hook that I use to describe to my 8-year-old daughter what I'm going to be talking about tonight, is that Sable Island has ponies, which indeed featured in a Wildcrafts episode, if any of you have children or grandchildren who are about 8 or 9. This is indeed, the pony is indeed the official horse of Nova Scotia. My partner is from Nova Scotia, and I asked her if she was aware of this, and she said she was unaware that Nova Scotia had an official horse, much less that it was the Sable Island pony. But there you go. That might be a trivia question that you can answer. It's also mentioned specifically in the British North America Act, stipulating that indeed Canada and not the United Kingdom is responsible for Sable Island. And since 1872, there's been a permanent human presence on the island in the form of a life-saving station, as well as 2 lighthouses in the east and west points of the island. But really, other than brief forays of landing amateur air pilots on the island, it really has not been known for its aviation history. And part of it is I want to change that because there's a fascinating history of aviation that connects to Sable Island, and we'll explore that tonight. So let's start. Second World War. So at the start of the Second World War and the organization of transatlantic convoys operating out of Halifax, the RCAF immediately was seeking to provide air cover for these convoys. And starting in 1940, the RCAF operating Supermarine Stanraer aircraft, which you can see in the top, that's the two propeller plane there that I have a picture of. They were operating these, and if you were able to refuel at Sable Island, it gave an extra day of air cover for convoys departing from Halifax. So what they did was they floated 45-gallon fuel drums to Sable Island. And if you look at the picture, and I'm going to go back to the previous slide. If you look at Sable Island and imagine it instead of being flat in the middle, but it's a trough. And in that trough, at various points, is filled up with water and formed freshwater lakes. So one of those lakes they colloquially referred to as Rice Lake. And the idea was to float and put fuel drums in the lake, and then the planes could then land on the lake, refuel, and then take off, giving them extra cover. It also was provided an emergency landing spot in case of disasters. And indeed, in December of 1940, one of the Stanraers, piloted by Flying Officer Leonard Burchell, who later on becomes known as the savior of Ceylon when he's stationed in the Indian Ocean, and it was a long career after this. But at this point, he's a pilot officer on a Stanraer flying out of Dartmouth in 1940. And his plane runs, they get lost in a storm, and his plane runs out of fuel. And luckily, they land on Sable Island on Rice Lake on zero fuel, but then they have to refuel. And this involves, and he describes in a book called Salty Dips, he says, one man swam ashore and had to go get one 45-gallon drum, roll it down, got a hold of it, and drifted downwind with the drum. When he got to the airplane, we grabbed him. Then he righted the drum and held onto it with one arm, using the other one to hold onto the walkway on the side of the aircraft. Then we knocked the bung out of the drum, put the pipe in her, got the pump going, and started to pump the gas. The minute the drum floated high enough so we could grab it, we pulled the poor airman out. So remember, this is December 1940, and the poor man is having to swim in this lake to go get the drum. Ultimately, they have to do about 12 loads, and what they do is Burchell is there operating the pump, and the other four crew members, one is swimming naked in the water, getting the fuel drum, and the other three are in a sleeping bag, trying not to get hypothermia and warming up before it's their turn to go in the water. So this does indeed save their plane, and they managed to make it back to Dartmouth. But it's not really a sustainable method of refueling. However, this doesn't stop. In 1942, the Royal Navy decides to contact the Royal Canadian Navy contacts the Royal Naval Shore Establishment, HMS Saker, which is in Dartmouth, and gets the Fleet Air Arm to station two Supermarine walruses, which you can see underneath, which the pilots were affectionately referred to as shag bats, and also described their performance as exactly what one would expect if one put wings on a walrus. And they stationed the two of them on Sable Island starting in July of 1942. However, Sable Island, in addition to being known for all of the things I've listed before, is also exceptionally foggy. So over the course of the first 2 weeks that they were stationed on the island, they only managed to fly for 7 hours in total, not 7 hours between the two planes. And ultimately, the experiment ended when on August 20th, 1942, one of the walruses had to make an emergency landing into the Atlantic Ocean and spent 3 days floating before the convoy they were supposed to be protecting indeed rescued them. They then were put under tow by the HMCS Napanee, where the walrus promptly sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. So that ended that involvement, and Sable Island was not used anymore, although as you can see in February of 1945, sometimes planes still landed on it, but those planes didn't take off again after they landed. However, the location of Sable Island in relation to North Atlantic shipping routes was too alluring to bypass. And this is part of the reason why there's so many shipwrecks on the island. Because if you're transiting to the east coast of the United States, the predominant sea lanes take you right past Sable Island. And the same goes if you're a German or later a Soviet submarine looking to attack the continental United States. So this is going to veer off. We're going to talk about submarines for a little bit, but it's important to understand so we can get to we can understand why naval aviators are so keen to use Sable Island. So There's a lot of technical details about the falling parchment that I'm not going to get into, but I'm happy to go into in the question period afterwards if you're interested in it. So starting in the early 1950s, the priority for NATO and for the US Navy and increasingly for the Canadian Navy switched to protecting North America from missiles launched from Soviet submarines. Originally, these submarines had a relatively limited range of which their missiles would fire and would have to get within 200 to 300 miles of the Atlantic coast. So you needed to be able to detect these submarines before they got that close and before they could launch their missiles. This is where we get the development of SOSUS, it's SOSUS, and what was known as Project Caesar. In short, this was underwater hydrophones that were laid out on cables up to 150 miles long and then were connected to a shore facility. The cables were known as Caesar cables, and that's where the code name for the project came from. The recordings from these microphones would be then processed through what was known as Project Jezebel, which allowed them to detect the unique low frequency sounds a submarine makes and identify roughly where that submarine was located in the North Atlantic. Due to what's known as deep sound channels, which is this whole complex science of oceanography, but essentially the shorthand is you could detect submarines hundreds of miles away from where the microphones were located. But in order to do so, you needed to be situated at certain points within the Atlantic Ocean. So there were some locations that were better than others. And the US Navy, starting in 1952, realized that Sable Island and the area off the coast of Nova Scotia was a particularly good location to place these underwater microphones. The only limitation was that the underwater microphones needed to be close to a shore facility because as the signal traveled along the cable, it would lose strength. And after a certain point, which was over 100 miles, the signal would just become noise and be useless. So the shore facilities had to be located decently close to where the microphones were. So in this case, if you can build the shore facility further out into the Atlantic, you can move the microphones further out into the Atlantic, and you can listen further out into the Atlantic. This is why Sable Island, being 300 kilometers offshore, is so alluring. And so in 1952, the US State Department's approach is external affairs, asking for the ability to do a hydrographic and oceanographic survey of Sable Island and Cape Sable, confusingly similarly named, in order to determine if it would be appropriate for building a naval shore facility for one of these listening stations. The Chiefs of Staff of Canada approved this in 1953. And the US briefing outlines exactly what they were intending to build on Sable Island. So they say on land, a station was a shore facility housing various electrical and electric components, communications, and other supporting components. An underwater array was laid on the ocean floor, no more than 150 miles from shore, and comprised of a long cable and an integrated array of hydrophones leading from the shore facility to deep water. In order to construct the station, a total of 4.83 acres would be required, plus another 11 acres for communications array and a possible 10 additional acres for a water catchment facility or a desalination plant. Overall, the US Navy anticipated that they would need to support and supply a staff of 62 people on Sable Island. And this was going to be the survey was a joint endeavor between the Royal Canadian Navy and the US Navy. So here's one of the cable laying ships for the Caesar cables. This is the Neptune that indeed laid most of them. And you can see the dots are where these stations were located. There's one in Argentia and Newfoundland. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the one off the coast of Nova Scotia and where it ultimately ends up getting built in a little bit. Right now, surveying Sable Island. You can see here the USS Maury was the ship that was sent to survey it. This is a picture of the captain, as it says, on the bridge of a four-legged frigate, also known as a horse. And the Maury was unable to land any of the survey team on the island, so they had to rely on helicopters from the HMCS Magnificent. This is, of course, the HO4 helicopter that was stationed on HMCS Magnificent. And all of these records have only recently become available through access to information, but as you can see in my other image, not all of the details about the survey have been released, and some have been held back. Ultimately, the US surveys, and they decide that Sable Island is not a good location for building anything. So in the summary, they state that in addition to problems of resupply, they found that connecting the undersea cables that link the underwater array to the shore station would be impossible. Cable-laying ships could only safely get within 5 miles of the island, and smaller boats that could get closer to shore were not capable of laying cables. Furthermore, the cost of maintaining shore facilities would be prohibitive. The combined action of sand and spray would corrode most exposed metals in a matter of years, and any exposed glass in a matter of months. All these factors led the U.S. Navy to conclude, as the RCN's liaison officer, Lieutenant N.T. Long, who we heard from the beginning of the presentation, wrote in a memo to the Chief of the Naval Staff, the U.S. Navy considers it would be far more logical to locate the station on the mainland. So that's what they do. And they asked for, in October of 1953, permission. You can see in the letter here, you don't need to read it, but this is just the letter requesting permission to construct a facility at Shelburne, Nova Scotia, which indeed they do construct here. And indeed, much of the facility is actually, much of the technology there is actually run by the WRENS, the Women's Section of the Royal Canadian Navy, whereas at American stations, it's not till 1976 that women are even trained to operate any of the SOSUS arrays. However, this is not the end of the interest in Sable Island. The U.S. Navy might have decided the technical and geographical challenges were too great in order to supply the island, but there was a continued human population on the island. And so I want to talk a little bit about, before we get to the discussion about the Royal Canadian Navy's interest in the island, I want to chat a little bit about the process of supplying the island that happens regularly. Because again, there's a weather station, a meteorological station on the island, and there's 2 lighthouses, an East and West Point lighthouse. And up till 1954, there is a life-saving station on the island as well. It's operated by the Coast Guard. So there's a large number of people, and they need to be supplied. One of the biggest problems simply is providing food for all of the people on the island. Because again, the ships, and predominantly up till 1959, it's the one in the rightmost picture in the corner there, the CS Lady Laurier, and they're tasked with bringing all the supplies to the island and then loading them on small boats, bringing them ashore onto a sand beach, and then using a mixture of carts and horse and people power in order to move that material to where it needs to be. So one of the biggest issues is simply bringing in enough fresh food. Prior to 1957, there's only a kerosene-operated refrigerator available, and they're very excited when they actually get a deep freeze unit that they advertise, or that is told to the staff, can freeze up to 500 pounds of meat. But in order to operate a deep freezer, you need electricity, and all of the energy is coming from generators that are and the generators are burning diesel fuel. So you have to be able to bring in a large quantity of fuel, which is very, very difficult. So the way it would work would be between 8 to 12 45-gallon drums would be loaded into a surf boat and then towed by a motor launch to the beach. The surf boat would be beached, and each drum would be rolled up above the normal wave height where a pumping station was set up. The drums are then pumped empty and taken inland for storage or returned to ship. As you can see in the color photograph on this page, storage largely meant just leaving them in the sand, which has now caused a massive environmental cleanup effort that the Sable Island Institute is involved in. This is some of the photographs from that. Mostly they were not returned to the ship. The problem with this setup is simply the sheer amount of time it took to unload the drums in direct comparison with the amount of diesel fuel required to fuel the generators. So over 450 drums worth of fuel would be required for a typical year, and that would necessitate about 55 trips back and forth with a surf boat. Even in good weather, which is a dubious proposition, the supply vessel would need to be moored off the island and be constantly loading and unloading for 1 week straight. Obviously, if bad weather prevents them making that trip, that can last multiple weeks and escalate costs greatly. So the Department of Transport is keenly aware of what the cost of supplying the Sable Island, and they're looking for ways to mitigate that. They also need to provide everything to the island. Again, other than sand and grass and horses and seabirds, there isn't anything there that isn't brought from the outside. And so for most government department detachments, the people who live there would be provided with a cash stipend in order to buy supplies that they would need. So tableware, toiletries, all of the basics that you would need to to provide, they'd be provided money to do this. However, there's a memo from 1956 from the Moncton District Controller stipulating that Sable Island is going to be clearly exempt from this policy, presumably because even if you gave cash to the local lighthouse keepers, they couldn't buy forks and spoons and tablecloths from the ponies and puffins. I don't think they sell them. So the answer was air resupply. And this is what the Department of Transport is keenly interested in. They're looking both at the possibility of helicopters, which we'll get to in a little later, but also simply of landing planes on the, we'll get there, simply landing planes on the beach at Sable Island. Along what's called Meteo Beach, because it's the closest to the meteorological station, when the tide goes out, it forms a fairly stable landing strip that you can land small planes on. Indeed, currently, to the present day, this is where they land planes on Sable Island. They even managed to land a DC-3 from the Department of Transport on the island and more importantly, get it to take off again. Again, landing planes is not particularly difficult. It's the making sure that those planes can take off again is the harder part. But they managed to successfully land and take off a DC-3 from the island. And they were able to use a variety of small aircraft with short takeoff ranges. And the Department of Transport throughout this period is looking into building a landing strip on the island, probably of about a length of 2,000 feet. So this is where things stand. Then the Royal Canadian Navy gets involved. But I want to talk a little bit about the broader strategic situation that's happening in the course of the late 1950s to understand why Sable Island becomes so key in their thinking. So we have pictures here. This is the HMCS Magnificent, which was a Canadian aircraft carrier, and it's subsequently replaced by the HMCS Bonaventure, which you can see in the bottom right picture here, particularly a tracker aircraft lining to take up off what was known affectionately as the Bonnie, and in the 1950s, there's a push, and I'm simplifying a whole bunch of sort of emerging and complex historical arguments, but essentially there's a push from within the Canadian Navy, and particularly within segments of the Royal Canadian Navy Aviation Wing, in order to acquire a second aircraft carrier. So the idea is that they get the Bonaventure, gets commissioned, but they want to either try and first keep the Magnificent, and failing that, when they do have the Bonaventure, they want to try and then get a second aircraft carrier, larger, what's known as an Essex-class aircraft carrier. And the goal about this is that they would have one would be a complete aircraft carrier that would operate anti-submarine warfare aircraft, plus fighter aircraft to provide air cover. And the second one would operate in a variety of functions, but either would be a dedicated anti-submarine warfare platform or simply a ferry platform that would greatly extend the range of the aircraft I have pictured here, the Tracker, which was the predominant anti-submarine warfare naval aircraft. There's a whole other Royal Canadian Air Force, as I'm sure many of you are aware, are operating at this point the Neptunes and then later the Argus that are operating off of land out of Greenwood and Summerside. But the Navy's looking to expand the range of their aircraft. Now, part of the reason for this is there's an exercise that really shapes their thinking. This happens in March of 1959. It's called Exercise Beaver Dam 3. And it happens right off the coast of Sable Island. And the idea behind this is to test out a concept known as the bear trap. Now, confusingly, within the Navy at the time, particularly naval aviation, there are two bear trap concepts. One, which many of you may be familiar with, is the innovation that's used to secure a helicopter landing to a small ship like a destroyer. That's known as the bear trap and works very effectively. This is a totally different version of the bear trap, presumably as a reference to the Russian bear and how they're going to trap Soviet or Russian submarines underneath the water. And the idea was that you concentrate surface and air forces within what are deemed probable missile launching areas. So areas where you think Soviet submarines that could launch missiles at Eastern North America are going to surface to launch. So between 200 and 300 miles offshore. And you concentrate your air assets within that area in such a density to ensure that a submarine can be observed and destroyed within 10 minutes of surfacing. 10 minutes was the magic number because that's how long they figured it would take for them to prime and launch the missiles that were located on board the submarine. At this point, they don't have underwater launching capabilities. So you have this 10-minute magic window, so you need to be able to reach anywhere within this giant area off the coast of Nova Scotia within 10 minutes, and that requires air assets. Surface assets are just way too slow to do this. But you need to have the ability then to have your aircraft operate on station for a lot longer than previously. Now, the way that the Royal Canadian Air Force solves this problem is that they develop planes like the Argus, which can fly for, I think, technically like a million hours, essentially. They can fly for very, 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 very long time and very long distances. An average patrol for an Argus operating out of Greenwood was 20 hours. The Argus also holds the record for the longest RCAF continuous flight without refueling at 32 plus hours, I think. So one is you build aircraft that can just fly forever, essentially, for longer than a day. The Navy doesn't have that option. The tracker does not have that range. So you need to extend the range for the tracker. One of the obvious ways is you get a second aircraft carrier. But when it became clear that the senior staff within the Canadian Armed Forces and certainly within the government were not going to be willing to spend money on a second aircraft carrier and the associated costs with that, the Navy or segments of the Navy start to look for other creative solutions. So this idea of what do we do and where do we fly our planes off of? And so I'm going to briefly introduce a few of the key personnel that are going to feature in the rest of the story. So going from left to right is Vice Admiral Kenneth Dyer, and he is the Maritime Commander Atlantic. So he's the senior flag officer on the Atlantic coast in the story. And he was a destroyer captain during the Second World War. But he later on, importantly, was an aircraft carrier guy. He served on HMS Glory and HMCS Warrior as second in command. And later on, he was a captain of the HMCS Magnificent. So he is a naval aviator. He's not a naval aviator. He doesn't fly the planes, but he is an aircraft carrier captain, and he understands these. Now, when I did this presentation for the Nautical Research Society, I said the two Navy guys are the heroes of this story, and of course, the man in the middle, Air Marshal Hugh Campbell, who was the chief of the air staff from 1957 to 1962, was of course the villain. Given that this is the Aviation Society, we can say that Hugh Campbell is the voice of reason in the room and the hero of the story, and then the Navy people are these crazy guys who love their ships. So pick and choose your heroes and villains. But Hugh Campbell was involved with the NATO Air Division in Europe and predominantly had very little experience with anti-submarine warfare or maritime air in general. And the last person there with the binoculars is pictured is Commodore D.W. Pierce. And again, he had served on the NATO staff as part of SACLANT, and he was serving as assistant chief of the Navy staff plans during the course of this investigation of Sable Island. But he is keenly aware of the NATO strategic imperative and the requirements for fulfilling the NATO mission regarding anti-submarine warfare. And so essentially it's a question of where do you view, and this is the way to view it, where do these figures view the threat coming from? Many of the naval aviators view the threat as being Soviet submarines are the key threat that needs to be stopped and countered, whereas many of the RCAF senior commanders are looking at the Soviet air threat, so looking at NORAD as being a solution to this problem. However, all of them see air defense in some form and as being the solution. The question is whether that's fighter aircraft or anti-submarine warfare aircraft. So in September of 1960, D.W. Pierce decides to brief the chiefs of the naval staff on the maritime commander, so Admiral Dyer's proposal to build an airstrip on Sable Island. And this again is in the theoretical discussion that he is proposing a construction of an airstrip on Sable Island. And he outlined 6 main reasons for constructing the airstrip, including greater training effectiveness, more operational time for the tracker aircraft. It also will provide a base of operations for naval aircraft outside of the Halifax area, because this idea of forced dispersion, in that they're presuming if Halifax is hit with a nuclear weapon, Shearwater's gone too, and you don't want to have a complete destruction of all of your anti-submarine warfare assets. So if you disperse them, they're safer, and presumably they're not going to waste a nuclear weapon hitting a strip of sand filled with ponies. There's also a fascinating collection where they show different charts about the fog, and they say, yes, Sable Island's foggy, but if you look on days when it's sunny in Shearwater, it's foggy in Sable Island, but vice versa. So actually, it would increase flying time, even though they get 172 days of fog a year. The sunny days are the days we need to be flying. So they have all this sort of convoluted logic. Needless to say, or from the get-go, Air Marshal Campbell is opposed. And he says in response to this briefing that the RCAF used Sable Island as an anti-submarine war base in Second World War, and it was abandoned due to the magnitude of logistical problems involved. He also says, quote, the weather is not suitable for flying operations. And so this is one of the stories throughout this, is that the RCAF is strongly opposed to any proposal to put aircraft on Sable Island. However, the Naval Aviation Branch continues their advocacy for this, and they send out a survey team. So this is 1960. This is what we started the presentation with. They send out a survey team that's led by N.T. Long, and they're stationed off the Cape Scott, which is the ship that I have pictured here. And they meet with the lighthouse keeper for the West Point Lighthouse, which is the other picture here, Arthur Dukes. His entire family lives on the island, in fact, and his 3 children are, in fact, grow up mostly on the island as well. This is the picture of the cute little girl with the unicorn jumper on is, we'll get to that in a second, but that's actually Sid Forward's son. And so they survey 2 locations. And the western location for the lighthouse is deemed flat and dry, but it would only be suitable for a runway of 2,700 feet in length. This is the location where the Department of Transport was looking to put a runway. But in the estimation of the survey team, the ground would likely rut badly with regular takeoffs and landings. And furthermore, limitations on length and width would make it unsuitable for tracker aircraft to operate off of the runway. The only possible location they thus decided was on Meteorological Station Beach. And this was where the Department of Transport had actually successfully landed the DC-3. So the survey team looked at the site and they proposed building a main runway of 6,500 feet for the tracker to land off and take, plus an emergency 4,500 foot long backup landing strip that could also be used by light aircraft for the Department of Transport. This is sort of the carrot they were offering to the Department of Transport to cooperate with this project, saying, look, you can use our backup runway whenever you want, and you can fly supplies in to provide supplies to your crew and your staff that are located on the island. And they said the runway they planned would be built on top of compacted sand using a mix of asphalt or soil cement with a bituminous coating. To stabilize the shoulders and overshoot area of the strip, the team proposed using either native grasses or having the Dominion Experimental Farm here in Ottawa specifically breed ryegrass that would be suitable to the sandy conditions. The team estimated the total cost of the runway was going to be $1.75 million. That's about $18.5 million in today's money, plus another $250,000 or $2.6 million in 2025 dollars to provide fabricated metal buildings for housing personnel and machines. The buildings, they stated, could be landed and erected on a prepared site in a short period of time and at relatively low cost. You should immediately be suspicious when anybody from the government or armed forces says something can be done for low cost, because that probably isn't true. They also didn't cost out any of the cost of replacing any of these facilities, which we know based on weathering every few years. They also stipulate clearly that the problem is there are no building supplies other than sand on the island, and it would also be exceptionally difficult to get any heavy machinery from onto the island in order to construct the airstrip. However, this proposal meets with enthusiastic support from the Naval Aviation Branch and gets put forward, and again is also supported by Maritime Commander Atlantic. So Lieutenant Commander E.F. Bruman, who is head of the aircraft facilities for Naval Aviation, and he writes to the director of Naval Aviation in the summer of 1961. So that was December 1960 was the survey. We're now into July of 1961. Naval Aviation is still pushing this idea. And he says, even though all persons we have contacted consider this proposal to be impractical, we are still fully in favor of it. So despite the fact that everybody they've talked to, from the U.S. Navy to the RCAF, has thoroughly discouraged them from engaging in this proposal, they are still going forward with it. Captain V.J. Wilgrass, who is the director of Naval Air Requirements, so he's the person whom E.F. Bruman was writing to, he says, quote, most authorities seem, like the RCAF, pessimistic about building a landing strip on the island, but I believe if we can provide a need, modern engineering should be able to solve all of our problems. It's suggested that operational analysis is the first way to tackle this problem. So this is, again, their ideas. They are convinced that there will be some technological solution to every possible problem we could come up with. And they're convinced that the operational need for a base on Sable Island is so great that it will justify the expense and the challenges in order for building this base. However, ultimately, in December of 1961, this is a year after the survey is conducted, the senior leadership of the RCN sunk or grounded, or whatever metaphor you'd like to use, this proposal for good. In a directive sent to Rear Admiral Kenneth Dyer from the Navy Chiefs of Staff, they state that the disadvantages of such an endeavor more than outweigh the advantages. Specifically, we instruct Dyer that it is no longer intended to contemplate any further action in this respect. It is not approved, therefore, to include this project in the Atlantic Command Base Development Plan. So that, for now, ends the interest of the Navy. And you can see that the other picture here, you can see one of the airplanes that is landed. This picture is taken in 1962 from Sid Forward, who's working at the meteorological station. His family was also on the island with him. But you can see, again, the airplanes just land on the sand. And that's why I like this picture. It demonstrates the existing solution to landing a plane on Sable Island was just landed on the sand at low tide. So this is not the end, though. Even though it's clear that a large-scale airstrip and facilities will not be built on the island due to the cost, there's still strong interest because, again, Sable Island, it's the strategic location, is simply too important to completely pass up. So in 1967, the newly formed Maritime Command, which is part of the unification process, they approached the Department of Transport, and instead of building a runway this time, they want to build a helicopter pad on the island. Department of Transport is enthusiastic about this because they see helicopter resupply as one of the ways of supplying some things like perishable items to the various outposts on the island. So they're enthusiastic. However, they say their problem is they cannot get civilian contractors to work on the island because it's impossible to adhere to labor standards that they would have to meet. So Department of National Defense says, no problem. We'll just tell the first engineers that they have to build this. We'll call it a training exercise and they'll work for free. So that's what they do. And they construct the helipad there. And the idea in this case is now to extend the range of Sea King helicopters and the Labrador search and rescue helicopters. They had previously both either, and I don't have a picture of a Labrador here, but I do have a picture of a Sea King. And they had previously been using the island as an emergency landing area. However, they were suffering serious damage from sand congestion as the helicopter engines kicked up such a massive amount of sand that it got into everything and would cause serious equipment damage. So the idea was, we realized the helicopters are going to end up using Sable Island at various points. We might as well make it safe for them to do so, then they can actually do so. Particularly in the case of the Labrador search and rescue aircraft, it greatly extended their range out into the Atlantic to have refueling capabilities located at Sable Island. For the Sea Kings, it was less important because by this point they're able to operate off of Canadian naval ships. However, it serves as an emergency landing pad and refueling location. And so a corrugated steel bin, 72 feet wide and 6 feet high, was filled with sand, you have, and then topped with wooden planks and aluminum sheets. Around the pad was a water pond, 18 inches deep, designed to keep sand congestion to a minimum. A catwalk of timber was then constructed to bridge the pond and allow foot access to the top of the pad. And the total cost of this project came out to be $17,410, or about $155,000 in today's money. This pad remains in use as a landing pad until the Canadian Coast Guard constructed a new primary landing pad in 1984. However, the 1968 pad, which you can see where the Sea King's landing, remains in use to this day as a secondary refueling point and a backup landing pad. So there still is the use of Sable Island as part of it. Again, the Sea King's primary mission during this time was as an anti-submarine warfare aircraft. So there still is a connection to this history of anti-submarine warfare within Sable Island. However, Sable Island has now been protected legislatively, and the thought now, of course, of building any facilities on there is is not going to happen. So a couple concluding remarks before we get on to questions. One, I think that the story, there's a lot of sort of, it demonstrates the idea of that there's ambition within the Canadian Naval Aviation branch, particularly to use, to seek to find solutions to the problem of extending the range of their aircraft. And when you don't have the ability to do that through an aircraft carrier, looking to essentially have a stable landing platform that you can have far out in the ocean, allowing you to greatly extend the range of the tracker aircraft is one of those solutions. But it also demonstrates the fact that the simple environmental challenges really dictate what is possible, what those solutions are available. And it also demonstrates the way that inter-service rivalries, particularly between the Royal Canadian Navy and the Royal Canadian Air Force, particularly over naval aviation, the future of aircraft that are operating out over the Atlantic Ocean, tasked with identifying and possibly destroying Soviet submarines. Who's going to be responsible for those aircraft, and who's going to get the bulk of resources? Ultimately, and I'd argue that's a fight the RCAF wins. They get, with both the Argus aircraft and subsequently the CP-140 Auroras, they get the bulk of the funding and available resources to create a maritime patrol fleet that is able to operate very effectively. The Navy also wants this role as well, and this is where, when ultimately they're unable to do that with fixed-wing aircraft, the Sea King becomes one of the solutions to that problem. And it demonstrates the ways in which these inter-service rivalries shape decision-making on both a larger scale level, but also on individual projects as well. And finally, I think, and this is an important one, that looking back at the 21st century lens, we see is that what's interesting is that, this will be the final slide, the environmental impact of these decisions is not calculated whatsoever. So the cost of destruction to a unique ecosystem that contains sort of rare birds and mammal species, was never taken into consideration in any of this planning or discussion, which now obviously is a major concern. So you can see how the priorities and discussions and the way we think about large-scale infrastructure projects, particularly when it comes to the environmental impact of aviation, has changed substantially over the course of the past 50 years. Because it's Sable Island, there's pictures of children and ponies. Thank you. And so I'm happy to take questions.